My husband publicly humiliated me at his law firm's charity gala, calling me just the wife who doesn't understand business. 3 hours later, he was escorted out in handcuffs while I was offered his partnership. Mira, darling, why don't you go powder your nose while the adults discuss the merger details? Nick Milbon's voice carried across the marble foyer of the Grandview Hotel's crystal ballroom, his words dripping with condescension as he dismissed me in front of the city's most powerful legal minds.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
The annual Children's Hospital Charity Gala was in full swing, 500 of the region's elite mingling beneath Austrian crystal chandeliers, and my husband had just reduced me to a decoration. I clutched my champagne flute tighter, my emerald cocktail dress suddenly feeling like a costume in this elaborate performance. Around us, partners from Sterling and Associates law firm exchanged knowing glances, their wives offering me sympathetic smiles that somehow made the humiliation burn deeper. Actually, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the heat creeping up my neck, I was quite interested in hearing about the environmental impact assessments for the Riverside Development Project. Nick's laugh was sharp, cutting through the ambient conversations. Environmental what? He turned to his colleagues with exaggerated amusement. See what I mean? She watches too much PBS and thinks she understands complex legal matters. Owen Sterling, the firm's managing partner, shifted uncomfortably beside his wife Carol, while Dave Milliken from the corporate division smirked into his scotch. The circle of power brokers that had welcomed me moments earlier now felt like an arena, with Nick positioning himself as the entertainer and me as the unwitting comedian. The EPA requires comprehensive studies for any development over 50 acres, I continued, my tone remaining conversational despite the growing audience, particularly when it involves wetland areas like the Riverside site. Mira, Nick's voice carried a warning now, his perfect smile faltering slightly. You're embarrassing yourself, these men have actual law degrees. The condescension hit its mark, exactly as he intended. Several people within earshot had turned to watch our exchange, drawn by the barely concealed tension. I caught sight of Heidi Kelly from the DA's office across the room, her expression unreadable as she observed the scene unfolding. Nick's wife has always been enthusiastic about causes, Aaron Stone from the litigation department offered diplomatically, though his tone suggested this was not the first time he'd witnessed such an exchange. I felt the familiar weight of the recording device concealed in my clutch purse, a habit I'd developed over the past 18 months of marriage to Nick. What had started as simple documentation of his increasingly volatile behavior had evolved into something far more systematic. Tonight, however, the device served a different purpose entirely. Perhaps I should explain, I said, setting down my champagne and opening my purse. I'm not just enthusiastic about environmental causes. I'm the lead EPA investigator assigned to review the Riverside Development Environmental Impact Assessment. The words landed like a physical blow. Nick's face went through a series of expressions, confusion, disbelief, then something approaching panic as the implications began to register. What are you talking about? He demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I pulled out my federal identification badge, the EPA seal gleaming under the ballroom lights. Special Agent Mira Chen, Environmental Protection Agency, Criminal Investigation Division. I've been investigating Sterling and Associates for the past 18 months for systematic environmental law violations and fraudulent impact assessments. The circle around us had grown larger, more partners and their spouses drawn by the tension. Owen Sterling's face had gone ashen, while Dave Milliken was frantically checking his phone, likely realizing the implications of what they'd just heard. You're an EPA agent, Carol Sterling breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. Specializing in corporate environmental crimes, I confirmed, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet section of the ballroom. Nick's pillow talk has been particularly enlightening regarding the firm's creative approach to environmental compliance. Nick grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin. You're lying, this is some kind of sick joke. I gently removed his hand from my arm, making sure several witnesses observed his aggressive behavior. The falsified wetland reports for Riverside, the buried soil contamination studies, the bribes to local inspectors. Did you really think pillow talk was privileged communication, Nick? That's attorney-client privilege, he sputtered, his legal training kicking in, despite his obvious panic. Between you and your clients, yes, I agreed calmly. But spousal privilege doesn't extend to federal crimes. And you're not my client. Nick, you're my subject. The revelation sent ripples through the gathering crowd. I could see phones being discreetly pulled out, text messages flying as word spread through the ballroom. The charity gala was rapidly transforming into something else entirely. Heidi Kelly had moved closer, no longer just an observer. As an assistant district attorney, she would understand exactly what was happening here. 18 months, Owen Sterling said slowly, the color completely drained from his face. You've been married to one of our associates for 18 months, and you're a federal agent. The marriage is real, I replied, glancing at Nick, who seemed to be struggling to process the magnitude of what was unfolding. My feelings were real, but Nick's complete lack of respect for environmental law, and for me, made this investigation necessary. You used me, Nick whispered, the realization finally hitting him fully. You used yourself, I corrected. Every late-night phone call about buried reports, every boast about outsmarting federal regulators, every casual mention of which judges were in the firm's pocket. You told me everything, Nick. You were so proud of how clever you all were. Dave Milliken had gone pale, clearly calculating which conversations he might have had within my earshot over the past year and a half. Aaron Stone was backing away slowly, as if physical distance might somehow protect him from what was coming. The beautiful charity gala, with its elegant decorations and atmosphere of legal prestige, had become the stage for the opening act of Sterling and Associates' downfall. And Nick, who had started the evening by dismissing me as just the wife who doesn't understand business, was about to learn exactly how much I understood about his business. The recording device in my purse had captured every word of his public dismissal of me, adding one final piece to a puzzle 18 months in the making. But this was just the beginning. The real show was about to start. The silence that followed my revelation lasted exactly 12 seconds. I counted them, watching Nick's face cycle through disbelief, rage, and something approaching terror as the full implications crashed over him like a wave. This is entrapment, he finally managed, his voice cracking slightly. You can't use anything I told you in private. We're married. There are laws about spousal privilege, yes, I interrupted calmly. But those protections don't extend to ongoing criminal conspiracies, and they certainly don't apply when one spouse is actively participating in federal crimes. Owen Sterling stepped forward, his expensive suit unable to mask the panic radiating from every pore. Agent Chen, surely we can discuss this privately. There must be some misunderstanding. Mr. Sterling, I said, pulling out my phone and showing him a photograph on the screen. This is a picture of you shaking hands with County Inspector Marcus Webb last Tuesday at the Riverside construction site. The briefcase you handed him contained $40,000 in cash to overlook the contaminated soil reports. Sterling's knees nearly buckled. How could you possibly have photographic evidence of your bribery? I smiled, scrolling to the next image. Because Special Agent Rodriguez has been documenting your meetings for the past 6 months. Would you like to see the video footage of you instructing your environmental consultants to falsify the wetland boundaries?
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Dave Milliken was frantically texting, his fingers flying over his phone screen. I made a mental note to inform the tech team that he was likely trying to delete files or warn other co-conspirators. Dave, I called out pleasantly, I hope you're not attempting to contact anyone about tonight's conversation. Federal agents have been monitoring Sterling and Associates communications since January. Every email, every phone call, every text message has been preserved. His phone clattered to the marble floor. Nick grabbed my shoulders, his grip painful and desperate. Mira, please, think about what you're doing. We're married, we have a life together. We have plans, we had plans, I corrected, gently but firmly removing his hands from my body once again, making sure the growing crowd of witnesses observed his increasingly aggressive behavior. Before I realized that the man I fell in love with was a criminal who views environmental protection as an inconvenience to be bought off. You fell in love with a lie then, Nick snarled, his mask of charm finally slipping completely. You think you know me, you don't know anything about the real world, about how business actually works. Carol Sterling was openly weeping now, the social implications hitting her as hard as the legal ones. Their reputation in this tight-knit community of legal and business elite was evaporating in real time. Actually, Nick, I know exactly how your business works, I said, opening my clutch and pulling out a small recording device. For instance, I know about the Clearwater Shopping Center project, where you buried the asbestos contamination reports. I know about the Heritage Park development, where you falsified the archaeological impact study. And I know about Judge Harrison's summer house that your firm financed in exchange for favorable rulings on environmental challenges. Aaron Stone had gone completely white. Judge Harrison, you can't prove. I can prove everything, Aaron, I said calmly. Nick was very thorough in his explanations. He was particularly proud of how the firm had tamed the environmental review process in this county. His words, not mine. The crowd around us had grown to include nearly half the gala attendees. Phones were out now, some recording, others frantically making calls. The annual charity event was rapidly becoming the legal scandal of the decade. Heidi Kelly from the DA's office pushed through the crowd, her prosecutor's instincts fully engaged. Agent Chen, how long has this investigation been ongoing? 18 months for my direct involvement, I replied. But the EPA has been building a case against environmental crimes in this region for over 3 years. My marriage to Nick simply provided unprecedented access to the inner workings of the conspiracy. Conspiracy, Owen Sterling's voice was barely a whisper. RICO charges are being prepared, I confirmed. Racketeering, bribery, conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice and environmental terrorism. Your firm hasn't just been bending the rules, Mr. Sterling. You've been systematically destroying protected ecosystems for profit. Nick was pacing now, his hands running through his perfectly styled hair. This is insane. You can't destroy my entire career over some wetland permits. Do you know how many jobs our developments create? How much revenue we bring to this community? I know exactly how much money you've made, I said quietly. And I know exactly what it's cost. The Riverside development alone has contaminated the groundwater for 6 miles downstream. Families are drinking poisoned water because your environmental reports were fabricated. The weight of that statement settled over the crowd like a physical presence. These weren't abstract legal violations anymore. These were crimes with real victims, real consequences for real people. Children have been getting sick, I continued, my voice carrying clearly across the now silent ballroom. Cancer clusters in neighborhoods downstream from your developments. Birth defects linked to chemical contamination. Your profits have a body count, Nick. That stopped his pacing. For the first time since my revelation began, Nick looked genuinely shaken rather than just angry or defensive. "You're lying," he whispered, but there was no conviction in his voice anymore. "I wish I were," I replied sadly. "But the medical records don't lie. Neither do the toxicology reports. Neither do the 18 months of recorded conversations where you and your colleagues laughed about tree huggers and government interference while poisoning entire communities." The charity gala, intended to raise money for the children's hospital, had become a stark reminder of why that hospital might be seeing more young patients than it should. Owen Sterling straightened his tie with shaking hands, falling back on lawyer instincts even as his world collapsed. "Agent Chen, we'll need to see warrants. We'll need to verify your credentials. We'll need—" "Mr. Sterling," I interrupted gently, "federal agents are executing search warrants at your offices right now. They've been waiting for my signal all evening." I pressed a button on my phone, and within 30 seconds the ballroom's main doors opened. Special Agent Maria Rodriguez entered, followed by a team of federal agents in dark suits. "Ladies and gentlemen," Agent Rodriguez announced, her voice carrying across the stunned crowd, "we need to speak with Owen Sterling, Nicholas Milburn, David Milliken, and Aaron Stone. You have the right to remain silent." The charity gala had become an arrest scene. And Nick, who had started the evening dismissing me as someone who doesn't understand business, was about to learn exactly how much I understood about his business. The federal agents moved through the ballroom with practiced efficiency, but I noticed something the panicking lawyers missed. This wasn't a surprise raid. Every step was choreographed, every movement planned down to the smallest detail. Agent Rodriguez caught my eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod. Phase 2 was beginning exactly on schedule. "Wait," I called out as the agents approached Nick and his colleagues. "Before you arrest them, I think there's something else they should hear." Rodriguez paused, understanding immediately. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by morbid fascination, as the city's legal elite found themselves at the center of a federal investigation. I pulled out my phone again, scrolling to a specific recording. "Nick, remember last month when you thought I was asleep? You had that late-night call with someone about the Riverside project. You were laughing about how the EPA was too stupid to figure out your system." Nick's face went ashen. "Mira, don't. I think everyone should hear this," I continued, pressing play. Nick's voice filled the ballroom through my phone's speaker, tinny but unmistakably clear. "The EPA morons actually think we did legitimate soil testing. If they only knew Webb just took photos of random dirt samples from across town. We saved $500,000 on actual testing, and these government idiots will never figure it out." Another voice responded, "Owen Sterling, what about your wife? Doesn't she work for some environmental group?" Nick's laughter was cruel and dismissive. "Mira, she volunteers for some tree-hugging charity, completely clueless about real environmental law. Sometimes I tell her about our cases just to watch her get all worked up about protecting wildlife. It's actually pretty entertaining." The recording continued with more damning details, but I stopped the playback and looked directly at Nick. His charming facade had completely crumbled, replaced by raw desperation. "You recorded our private conversations," he whispered, the betrayal evident in his voice. "I recorded criminal confessions," I corrected. "There's a difference." Owen Sterling was clutching his chest, looking like he might have a heart attack. "That was a privileged conversation between attorneys. Actually, Mr. Sterling," Agent Rodriguez interjected, "that conversation took place at Agent Chen's residence, which has been under federal surveillance as part of this investigation. Your privilege doesn't extend to criminal conspiracies discussed in a monitored location." Dave Milliken finally found his voice, though it came out as a croak. "Monitored? For how long?" 18 months, I replied calmly. Every conversation, every phone call, every meeting. Did you really think I was just the clueless housewife Nick painted me as? Carol Sterling looked at me with something approaching awe. You've been undercover this entire time. Not exactly, I said, and this was where the real twist would land. I wasn't initially undercover. I really did marry Nick because I loved him. But 3 months into our marriage, when he started bragging about falsifying environmental reports, I made a choice. The ballroom had gone completely silent, except for the soft classical music still playing from the sound system, creating a surreal soundtrack to the legal drama unfolding. I contacted the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division and volunteered to become an informant. I continued. Everything since then has been documented, recorded, and verified. Every crime Nick confessed to, every bribe he described, every environmental law they violated. It's all admissible evidence because I was acting as a federal agent. Nick staggered backward as if I'd physically struck him. You turned me in. Your own husband. You poisoned children, Nick, I said quietly. You contaminated drinking water for profit. You destroyed protected wetlands to build shopping centers. What did you expect me to do? Stand by and let you continue? Aaron Stone, who had been silent throughout most of the confrontation, suddenly stepped forward. You can't prove intent. We relied on environmental consultants. If their reports were flawed, Aaron, I interrupted, pulling up another recording on my phone. Would you like me to play the conversation where you instructed Ecological Solutions Inc. to find a way around the wetland designations for the Heritage Park project? The one where you specifically told them you didn't care if they had to falsify the species count. His mouth snapped shut. Heidi Kelly from the DA's office was taking notes frantically. As a prosecutor, she was undoubtedly already calculating how this evidence would play in court. Agent Chen, are you saying you have 18 months of recorded criminal confessions? Among other things, I confirmed. Nick was particularly talkative after a few drinks. He loved explaining how much smarter he was than federal regulators. He had quite a few stories about other lawyers in the city who were running similar schemes. The implication sent ripples through the crowd. This wasn't just about Sterling and Associates. This was potentially about the entire legal community's approach to environmental law. Owen Sterling made one last desperate attempt to regain control. Even if that's all true, you entrapped my associates. This was an illegal operation, Mr. Sterling. Agent Rodriguez stepped forward. Agent Chen was acting under the direct authority of the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Justice. Everything she did was legally authorized and supervised. Your associates entrapped themselves by committing federal crimes and then confessing to them. I looked around the ballroom at the faces of people I'd known for 18 months. Some showed shock, others admiration, and more than a few appeared to be calculating whether they'd ever said anything incriminating within my earshot. The hardest part, I said to the crowd, wasn't gathering the evidence. It was sitting through dinner parties where Nick and his colleagues laughed about the communities they were poisoning. It was pretending to be impressed when they bragged about bribing inspectors. It was watching them treat environmental protection as a joke while families got sick. Nick's desperation reached a new level. Mira, please. I love you. We can change. You can't change the cancer clusters downstream from Riverside, I replied sadly. You can't bring back the protected species that died when you destroyed their habitat. And you can't undo 18 months of documented federal crimes. Agent Rodriguez nodded to her team. Owen Sterling, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit environmental fraud, bribery of federal officials, and racketeering. As the Miranda rights echoed through the crystal ballroom, I realized this was only the beginning. The real investigation was just starting, and these arrests would send shockwaves through every law firm, every development company, and every government office that had been part of this system. The charity gala was over, but the real work was about to begin. As the handcuffs clicked around Nick's wrists, I watched 18 months of careful planning reach its first major milestone. But what happened next would shock even me, and I thought I was prepared for everything. "Agent Chen," Rodriguez said quietly as she approached me, "we have a problem." The ballroom was still buzzing with chaos, federal agents processing arrests, lawyers frantically making phone calls, socialites recording everything on their phones for social media. But Rodriguez's tone cut through all of it. "What kind of problem?" I asked, though something in her expression told me this wasn't about the arrests we'd just made. She handed me her phone, showing a text message that had just come in. "Judge Harrison has issued an emergency injunction blocking all searches and seizures. Claims federal overreach. All evidence collected tonight is now inadmissible." My blood ran cold. Judge Harrison, the same judge Nick had bragged about buying with a summer house. How is that possible? He can't have jurisdiction over a federal investigation. He's claiming it under the Emergency Powers Act, Rodriguez explained grimly. Says environmental regulations are being used to circumvent property rights. The injunction is already being enforced. Our teams at Sterling and Associates offices have been ordered to stop and leave. Nick, who had been slumped in defeat just moments before, suddenly straightened up. Even with his hands cuffed behind his back, I could see the hope returning to his eyes as other lawyers in the crowd began checking their phones and receiving similar updates. "Looks like Judge Harrison remembers who his friends are," Owen Sterling called out, his voice regaining some of its usual arrogance despite his own handcuffs. "Federal agents might want to think twice before harassing local businesses." But I smiled, and that seemed to worry them more than my anger had. "Agent Rodriguez," I said loud enough for everyone to hear, "please show them Exhibit A47. Rodriguez looked confused for a moment, then understanding dawned on her face. She pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through files. "Ah yes, the summer house. What summer house?" several people asked simultaneously. I turned to address the crowd, many of whom were still recording with their phones. "Judge Harrison's beautiful new summer retreat on Lake Clearwater. The one that Sterling and Associates purchased for him last year as a thank you for his consistently favorable rulings on environmental challenges." Nick's renewed confidence evaporated instantly. "You can't prove that." "Actually, I can," I said, taking the tablet from Rodriguez and holding it up so the crowd could see. "These are the property records, purchase agreements, and bank transfers, all dated and signed." But more importantly, I swiped to the next screen, showing a photograph. "This is Judge Harrison at his housewarming party last September. And that's Nick handing him a bottle of champagne and the deed to the property. Interesting timing, considering Harrison ruled in favor of the Riverside development just 3 weeks later." The crowd pressed closer to see the photograph. It was crystal clear, Judge Harrison accepting what was obviously an expensive gift from the very lawyers who regularly appeared before his court. Dave Milliken, despite his handcuffs, managed to stammer, "That could be anything. A birthday gift, eh?" I interrupted, swiping to another photo. "This is you and Harrison playing golf at the country club 2 days before he dismissed the wetland protection lawsuit. Notice the new golf clubs you're carrying. The same ones itemized on this receipt from Sterling and Associates business account." Aaron Stone had gone pale again. "How do you have these photos?" "Because Judge Harrison's summer house isn't just a bribe," I explained, enjoying the growing panic in their eyes. "It's also been under federal surveillance for the past 8 months. Every visitor, every meeting, every envelope of cash exchanged on that deck, overlooking the lake." Agent Rodriguez nodded, taking back the tablet and scrolling through more evidence. We have video footage of 16 separate occasions where Sterling and Associates partners visited Judge Harrison's residence to discuss pending cases. We also have audio recordings of those conversations, thanks to the surveillance equipment installed during the house's renovation. Owen Sterling's face had gone from pale to gray. "You bugged a federal judge's house. We monitored a location where federal crimes were being planned and executed," Rodriguez corrected. Judge Harrison lost his expectation of privacy when he turned his residence into a criminal enterprise. The implications were sinking in for everyone present. This wasn't just about environmental fraud anymore. This was about judicial corruption at the highest levels. So when Judge Harrison issued that emergency injunction, Heidi Kelly from the DA's office began. "He was attempting to obstruct justice in a federal investigation where he's a co-conspirator," I finished. "Which means the injunction itself is evidence of additional federal crimes." Nick looked like he might vomit. "Mira, you don't understand what you're doing. Harrison has connections that go all the way to the state Supreme Court," I interrupted. "The governor's office? The attorney general?" I pulled out my own phone and showed him a contact list. "Nick, did you really think 18 months of investigation only focused on one corrupt judge and one law firm? This network goes much deeper than you ever imagined." Agent Rodriguez's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She answered it, listened for a moment, then smiled broadly. "That was the U.S. Attorney's Office," she announced to the crowd. "Judge Harrison has just been arrested at his chambers for attempting to obstruct a federal investigation. His emergency injunction has been vacated, and all search warrants are back in effect." The lawyers' faces went through another cycle of shock and despair. Just when they thought they had a lifeline, it had been severed. But I wasn't done. "The really beautiful part," I said, looking directly at Nick, "is that Judge Harrison's arrest was based on evidence we collected tonight. The moment he issued that injunction, he proved he was part of the conspiracy. He walked right into the trap." Carol Sterling whispered, "How many people are involved in this?" "More than you know," I replied. "But fewer than there were yesterday. This investigation has been growing for months, and tonight was just the first phase of arrests." As if on cue, Agent Rodriguez's phone buzzed with another update. She read it and looked up with grim satisfaction. "County Inspector Marcus Webb has just been arrested at his home. The EPA team found $2 million in cash hidden in his garage, along with falsified environmental reports dating back 5 years." The dominoes were falling faster now, each arrest leading to the next. And at the center of it all was Nick, who had started the evening by dismissing me as someone who doesn't understand business. He was about to learn that I understood his business better than he did. The ballroom had transformed into something resembling a crime scene, with federal agents coordinating arrests while the remaining gala attendees watched in stunned fascination. But as I looked around at the faces of people who thought they knew me, I realized it was time for the complete truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice carrying across the now quiet ballroom, "I think there are some misconceptions about who I really am that need to be cleared up." Nick, despite his handcuffs, turned to stare at me with a mixture of hatred and confusion. "What are you talking about now, Mira? Haven't you done enough?" I smiled sadly at the man I had once loved. "Nick, you've spent 18 months telling people I was just some naive environmentalist who volunteered for tree-hugging charities. You told them I didn't understand real environmental law." Agent Rodriguez stepped closer, and I could see she was curious about where this was heading as well. "The truth is," I continued, pulling out my federal identification again, but this time opening it to show additional credentials, "I'm not just EPA Agent Mira Chen, I'm Senior Special Agent Mira Chen, head of the EPA's Environmental Crimes Task Force for the entire Pacific Northwest region. The gasps from the crowd were audible. Even some of the federal agents looked surprised. I've been investigating environmental crimes for 12 years, I continued. I have a law degree from Stanford, a master's in environmental science from Berkeley, and I've personally overseen prosecutions that have resulted in over $2 billion in environmental crime convictions. Owen Sterling's legs actually gave out, and he had to lean against a marble pillar for support. 12 years, you're not some junior agent. I'm the senior agent who developed the federal protocols for investigating systematic environmental fraud. I confirmed. The same protocols that are being used in 14 states to prosecute cases just like this one. Dave Milliken was shaking his head in disbelief. But you seemed so, you asked such basic questions. I asked questions I already knew the answers to, I explained. Every time Nick explained how your schemes worked, I was testing whether he would tell the truth or try to minimize your crimes. He failed every test. I turned to address the broader crowd, many of whom were still recording everything on their phones. What Nick and his colleagues didn't realize is that I was sent here specifically because of their activities. The EPA had been tracking suspicious environmental reports in this region for 3 years before I ever met Nick. Agent Rodriguez nodded, understanding now why this case had been given such high priority. Agent Chen is one of only 12 senior environmental crimes investigators in the entire country. When we identified the corruption network operating here, she volunteered for the undercover assignment. Volunteered, Carol Sterling whispered. My previous case involved a similar network in Oregon, I explained. 37 corporate executives went to federal prison, and we recovered over $400 million in environmental damage penalties. But the mastermind escaped because we couldn't penetrate his inner circle. I looked directly at Nick, who was staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. When the EPA identified Sterling and Associates as the center of a similar network, I volunteered to go undercover. We knew we needed someone inside their personal lives to document the full scope of the conspiracy. So when you met Nick, Heidi Kelly began. It wasn't a coincidence, I confirmed. We knew Nick attended environmental law conferences, so I made sure to be at the same conference in Seattle where we met. We knew he was single and looking for someone impressive but not threatening to his ego. Nick's face had gone completely white. Our entire relationship was fake. My feelings weren't fake, I said quietly. That's what made this so difficult. I genuinely fell in love with you, Nick, but I couldn't let that stop me from doing my job when you started confessing to federal crimes. Aaron Stone found his voice. You're saying the EP has been planning this for 3 years. Longer than that, Agent Rodriguez interjected. Agent Chen's investigation has uncovered similar networks in 7 states. This isn't just about environmental crimes anymore. It's about systematic corruption of the legal system itself. I pulled out a thick folder from my purse, the same purse that had held recording devices all evening. This contains evidence of environmental crimes in California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, and Montana, all connected to law firms, using the same methods Sterling and Associates perfected here. The scope was finally becoming clear to everyone present. This wasn't a local scandal, it was a federal case with national implications. The Riverside development that poisoned local groundwater, I continued. That was replicated in 12 other locations across the western United States. The bribery system Nick bragged about? We've documented identical operations in 6 other states. Owen Sterling slumped against the pillar. How many people know about this? The FBI, EPA, Department of Justice, and attorneys general in 7 states have been coordinating this investigation. Agent Rodriguez answered. Tonight's arrests are happening simultaneously in multiple cities. I checked my phone and saw the confirmations coming in. Portland, Seattle, Denver, Phoenix, Las Vegas, similar arrests are being made right now. Environmental crime networks that have operated for years are being dismantled simultaneously. Nick was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, complete and total disbelief. You're not the woman I married. I'm exactly the woman you married, I replied sadly. You just never bothered to really know who that was. You were so convinced of your own superiority that you never asked about my background, my education, or my career before we met. Carol Sterling wiped tears from her eyes. You gave up 3 years of your life for this case. I gave up 3 years to protect communities from poisoned water and contaminated soil, I corrected. To prevent more children from getting cancer because corporate lawyers think environmental protection is optional. The weight of the revelation was settling over everyone present. The woman they had dismissed as Nick's naive wife was actually one of the most senior environmental crime investigators in the federal government, and she had just brought down a criminal network that spanned half the country. As the full scope of my identity settled over the crowd, I knew it was time to reveal the true horror of what Nick and his colleagues had been doing. The environmental crimes weren't just abstract legal violations, they had real victims, real consequences that these lawyers had callously ignored. Agent Rodriguez, I said, pulling up a presentation on my phone and connecting it to the ballroom's display system. I think everyone here should see what Sterling and Associates business practices actually look like. The first image that appeared on the large screens around the ballroom was an aerial photograph of a residential neighborhood. Modest homes, neat lawns, children's playgrounds visible in several backyards. This is Riverside Meadows, I announced. A community of 847 families living downstream from the Riverside development that Nick's firm helped approve. Beautiful area, isn't it? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, though I could see confusion about where this was heading. I clicked to the next image, the same neighborhood, but with a medical facility prominently featured. This is Riverside Meadows today. That building is the temporary cancer treatment center that had to be established because of the unusually high rates of childhood leukemia in this community. The silence was deafening. 43 children under the age of 12 have been diagnosed with cancer in the past 18 months, I continued. My voice steady but carrying the weight of each case. The groundwater contamination from the Riverside development, the contamination that Nick's falsified environmental reports claimed didn't exist, has been linked to every single case. Nick tried to interrupt. You can't prove that connection. Actually, Nick, we can. I clicked to the next slide, showing medical charts and toxicology reports. The EPA's Medical Investigation Unit, working with the CDC, has definitively linked the specific chemical contamination from Riverside to the cancer cluster. The same chemicals that your environmental consultant was paid to ignore. Carol Sterling was openly weeping now. Children are dying. 43 diagnosed, 17 in active treatment, 4 who didn't make it, I said, quietly. Including 6-year-old Emma Rodriguez, no relation to Agent Rodriguez, who loved to draw pictures of the butterflies in her backyard. She died 3 months ago. The weight of that single name, that single life, seemed to press down on everyone in the ballroom. This wasn't about regulatory violations anymore. This was about a little girl who would never grow up, because lawyers prioritized profits over safety. I clicked to the next image, a photograph of a young girl with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile, holding a crayon drawing of colorful butterflies. Emma's mother, Patricia Rodriguez, is here tonight, I announced. She's been working with our investigation, providing medical records and testimony about how the contamination affected her family. A woman stepped forward from the crowd. I hadn't noticed her before, but she had been quietly observing from the back of the ballroom. Her eyes were red with recent tears, but her expression was determined. Patricia volunteered to attend tonight's gala, I continued, to see the faces of the people who poisoned her daughter. Patricia Rodriguez stepped closer to where Nick stood in handcuffs. Her voice was quiet, but carried clearly across the silent ballroom. Mr. Milburn, you met my daughter once, last year at the community meeting about the water quality concerns. She asked you if the water was safe to drink. Do you remember what you told her? Nick's face had gone ashen. I could see that he did remember. You told her that lawyers wouldn't let anything bad happen to kids, Patricia continued. You patted her head and said she could trust you to keep her safe. The silence stretched on as everyone processed the devastating irony of that promise. I clicked to the next slide, a map showing the full scope of contamination. The Riverside development isn't the only site. We've identified 17 separate locations where Sterling and Associates provided falsified environmental assessments that led to contamination of water supplies. Owen Sterling found his voice, though it was barely a whisper. 17. The Heritage Park Shopping Center contaminated the water supply for 2,400 families. The Clearwater office complex leaked industrial solvents into an elementary school's groundwater. The Sunset residential development was built directly on top of a former chemical disposal site that your reports claimed was remediated. I paused to let the scope sink in. In total, we estimate that over 15,000 people have been exposed to dangerous levels of contamination due to environmental reports that Sterling and Associates knew were falsified. Dave Milliken was shaking his head frantically. We didn't know people would get sick. We thought the contamination levels were acceptable. Dave, I interrupted, pulling up another document. This is an internal email you sent to Owen Sterling 8 months ago. You wrote, and I quote, "The soil contamination at Heritage Park is off the charts, but if we bury this report, we can close the deal and worry about the health consequences later." His mouth snapped shut. Aaron Stone tried a different approach. Those were just business decisions. We couldn't have known. Aaron, I said, displaying another email, this is your message to the environmental consulting firm working on Clearwater. You specifically instructed them to find lower contamination numbers or find a new job. When they refused, you hired a different firm and had them falsify the results. I looked around the ballroom at the faces of people who were finally understanding the true scope of what they had witnessed. This wasn't just white-collar crime. This was systematic poisoning of entire communities. The pattern is always the same, I explained. Identify a development site with environmental problems, find consultants willing to falsify reports for money, bribe inspectors to overlook obvious violations, rush the projects through before anyone can investigate properly. Patricia Rodriguez spoke again. My daughter trusted you to keep her safe. Every child in our neighborhood trusted the adults to protect them. Nick looked like he might collapse. The weight of those trusting eyes, those small voices asking if the water was safe, seemed to be crushing him. But I wasn't finished revealing the pattern yet. The emotional weight of Patricia Rodriguez's testimony had settled over the ballroom like a shroud, but I needed everyone to understand that tonight's revelations were the result of years of meticulous planning, not a spontaneous investigation. What you've witnessed tonight, I began, moving away from the screens showing contamination sites, represents the culmination of the most complex environmental crime investigation in EPA history. The planning began long before I ever met Nick. Agent Rodriguez stepped forward with a timeline displayed on her tablet. The EPA first identified suspicious patterns in environmental reporting in this region 4 years ago. Unusually high approval rates for developments in protected areas, consistently favorable toxicology reports, despite obvious contamination, and a network of environmental consultants who seemed to specialize in finding acceptable levels of dangerous chemicals. I nodded, pulling up my own documentation. The breakthrough came when we realized that similar patterns were emerging in 7 different states, all following the same methodology. Law firms would identify potentially profitable but environmentally problematic sites, then systematically circumvent environmental protections through falsified reports and bribery. Owen Sterling, despite his handcuffs, found his voice. "You're saying this investigation has been going on for 4 years?" "The preliminary investigation, yes," I confirmed. "But the decision to go undercover was made 2 years ago when we identified Sterling and Associates as the hub of the network." Nick wasn't chosen randomly. He was selected because his social media presence and conference attendance made him an ideal target for an undercover approach. The implications were staggering. Every conversation, every dinner party, every intimate moment of their relationship had been part of a federal investigation. Nick's voice was barely a whisper. 2 years of planning just to get to me. "Not just to get to you, Nick," I replied gently. "To understand how the entire system worked. We needed someone inside the social and professional network who could document not just the crimes, but the culture that enabled them." I pulled out another device, a sophisticated recording system that looked nothing like the simple device I'd shown earlier. "This is military-grade surveillance equipment, provided by the Department of Justice for long-term undercover operations. Every conversation in our home, every phone call you made, every meeting you attended was recorded and analyzed by a team of federal prosecutors." Dave Milliken looked sick. "Everything, everything," Agent Rodriguez confirmed. "The dinner party where you all laughed about tree huggers being too stupid to understand real estate development. The golf outings where you planned which inspectors to bribe next. The late-night calls coordinating falsified reports across multiple states." I moved closer to the group of arrested lawyers, making sure they could see the determination in my eyes. But the technical surveillance was only part of the strategy. We also needed to understand the psychology of the network. How otherwise intelligent lawyers convinced themselves that poisoning communities was acceptable. Carol Sterling spoke through her tears. "You studied us like laboratory specimens." "We studied criminal behavior," I corrected. "And what we found was a group of people who had become so isolated from the consequences of their actions that they could joke about children's cancer while sipping champagne." I gestured toward Patricia Rodriguez, who was still standing near the arrested men. "Every month of this investigation, I filed reports with our victim liaison team. They tracked the health impacts in real time. Every new cancer diagnosis, every family forced to relocate, every child who couldn't drink their tap water." Nick looked up at me with something approaching desperation. "If you knew people were getting sick, why didn't you stop us sooner?" "Because stopping you without dismantling the entire network would have accomplished nothing," I replied. "Your firm would have been replaced by another one. The corrupt inspectors would have found new lawyers to work with. The judges you bribed would have continued taking money from someone else." Agent Rodriguez pulled up a organizational chart on her tablet. "This investigation has identified 47 law firms, 23 environmental consulting companies, 15 county inspectors, 8 state officials, and 6 federal judges involved in similar schemes across 7 states. Arresting just Sterling and Associates would have been like treating a symptom while ignoring the disease." Aaron Stone was shaking his head frantically. "You can't prosecute everyone. The legal system would collapse." "The legal system was already corrupted," I replied sharply. "We're not destroying it, we're cleaning it up. And yes, that means some very uncomfortable changes for a lot of people who thought they were above the law." I pulled out my phone and showed them a series of messages that had been coming in throughout the evening. Portland, 12 arrests. Seattle, 18 arrests. Denver, 9 arrests. Phoenix, 15 arrests. Las Vegas, 7 arrests. Every single arrest based on evidence gathered through operations like this one. The scope was overwhelming. This wasn't just about one corrupt law firm or even one corrupt city. This was a coordinated federal response to systematic environmental crime across multiple states. The strategy required patience, I continued. 2 years of documented evidence, hundreds of hours of recorded conversations, financial records from dozens of accounts, video surveillance of bribery transactions, and most importantly, building cases that would be absolutely bulletproof in federal court. Owen Sterling slumped against his restraints. How many years in prison are we looking at? That depends on how cooperative you decide to be, Agent Rodriguez answered. Environmental terrorism carries a maximum sentence of 25 years. Racketeering adds another 20. Conspiracy to commit murder. Murder, Dave Milliken interrupted. When you knowingly contaminate water supplies and children die as a result, that's felony murder under federal law, I explained calmly. Emma Rodriguez and the other children who died weren't accidental casualties. They were predictable victims of decisions you made knowing the likely consequences. The weight of that legal reality settled over them like a physical blow. They had thought they were clever businessmen bending environmental rules. They were actually facing potential life sentences for environmental terrorism and murder. But the strategy had required one more element that I hadn't yet revealed. The ballroom had become eerily quiet except for the soft sounds of federal agents coordinating with their teams across multiple states. But I needed everyone to understand why this investigation had become so personal for me, why I had been willing to sacrifice years of my life to expose this network. Before I met Nick, I began, my voice carrying a weight of memory. I worked a case in Oregon that changed everything for me. It was called the Blackwater River Investigation. I pulled up a photograph on the display screens. A river that should have been crystal clear but ran dark with contamination. 3 years ago, Cascade Environmental Solutions, a law firm very similar to Sterling and Associates, helped a chemical company build a processing plant upstream from the town of Millbrook. Agent Rodriguez stepped closer, understanding that this was the personal foundation of everything we had accomplished tonight. The environmental impact reports claimed the plant would have minimal effect on local water quality. I continued. Local families were assured that the most advanced filtration systems would prevent any contamination. Children swam in the Blackwater River every summer. Families had been drinking from private wells fed by the same aquifer for generations. Nick was staring at me with growing comprehension. You've done this before. I led the investigation, I confirmed. But we arrived too late. By the time the EPA was called in, the contamination had been ongoing for 8 months. 47 families had been exposed to industrial chemicals at levels that were catastrophic. The silence stretched as everyone processed the implications. 12 children died, I said quietly. Not over months or years, within 6 weeks of our investigation beginning. The chemical exposure was so severe that it caused rapid organ failure in developing bodies. Carol Sterling gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. But the worst part, I continued, wasn't the deaths. It was discovering that Cascade Environmental Solutions knew about the contamination from day one. Internal emails showed they had laughed about rural families being too ignorant to understand environment. They had specifically chosen a poor rural community because they believed no one would fight back. I clicked to the next image. A courtroom photograph showing lawyers in expensive suits standing confidently while families in their Sunday best sat in the gallery, many holding photographs of deceased children. We had evidence. We had witnesses. We had scientific proof of causation, I said, my voice hardening. But Cascade Environmental Solutions had something more powerful, a network of corrupt judges, bought inspectors, and a legal system that protected corporate interests over human lives. Dave Milliken was shaking his head. What happened? The case was dismissed on a technicality, I replied bitterly. The lead partner at Cascade Environmental Solutions, a lawyer named Marcus Webb, no relation to your inspector, had paid off the judge. The family's wrongful death lawsuits were thrown out. The chemical company was fined $12,000 and allowed to continue operating. The amount was so absurdly small compared to the human cost that several people in the crowd made sounds of disbelief. $12,000, I repeated. For 12 dead children. Webb personally made more money that week than the fine his client paid for killing those kids. Owen Sterling's voice was barely audible. Did he go to prison? He was promoted to senior partner, I said. The success of the Blackwater River case made him one of the most sought-after environmental lawyers on the West Coast. He built a mansion with the money he made helping corporations poison communities. I paused, letting the full horror of that injustice settle over everyone present. That's when I volunteered for undercover work, I continued. Because traditional investigation methods weren't enough. We needed to get inside these networks, to understand how lawyers like Webb, and like all of you, justify destroying lives for profit. Nick's voice cracked. So this was always about revenge. This was about preventing another Blackwater River, I corrected. About making sure that families like the ones in Millbrook never have to bury their children because lawyers think environmental protection is optional. I clicked to another image. A memorial garden with small headstones, each bearing the name and photograph of a child who had died from chemical exposure. I attended every funeral, I said quietly. I looked into the eyes of parents who had trusted their government to protect their children. I held babies who were dying from contamination that could have been prevented if one lawyer had chosen to tell the truth instead of taking a bribe. Patricia Rodriguez stepped forward again, her voice steady despite her tears. That's why you came here. To make sure Emma and the other children wouldn't die for nothing. Every child in Riverside Meadows, every family affected by your contamination, I said, looking directly at the arrested lawyers. They deserved the protection that the Millbrook families never got. Aaron Stone found his voice. But you could have just investigated us normally. You didn't have to. Marry your colleague and document every crime for 18 months. I interrupted. Aaron, the Blackwater River investigation took 3 years and resulted in 0 prosecutions. Traditional methods don't work when the entire system is corrupted. Agent Rodriguez pulled up another display. A map showing the locations of similar environmental crime networks across the western United States. Agent Chen's undercover work has provided the evidence base for prosecutions that traditional investigation could never achieve. The Blackwater River families will finally see justice. Marcus Webb was arrested tonight in Portland, I announced. Along with 14 other lawyers from his firm. The evidence we gathered about Sterling and Associates led to warrants for Cascade Environmental Solutions. The families in Millbrook will finally have their day in court. The emotional weight of 3 years of grief, determination, and sacrifice seemed to settle over the ballroom. This wasn't just about Nick's crimes or even Sterling and Associates' corruption. This was about systemic change born from personal tragedy. That's why I was willing to sacrifice everything, I said, looking around at the faces of people who were finally understanding the true scope of what they had witnessed. Because somewhere tonight, there's another little girl drawing pictures of butterflies, trusting that the adults in her world will keep her safe. But the personal motivation was only part of the story. The network we had exposed was larger and more dangerous than even the Blackwater River case had prepared me for. As the weight of the Blackwater River tragedy settled over the crowd, Agent Rodriguez stepped forward with a tablet displaying what looked like an organizational chart. But this wasn't just any chart. It was a map of corruption that stretched across multiple states and levels of government. What Agent Chen hasn't told you yet, Rodriguez announced, is that she wasn't working alone. This investigation involved the largest interagency cooperation in EPA history. I nodded, pulling up my own documentation. The network we exposed tonight required resources and coordination that no single agent could manage. What you've witnessed is the result of collaboration between 7 federal agencies, 4 state attorney general offices, and over 40 local law enforcement departments. Nick stared at me with growing horror. How many people knew about this? Everyone who needed to know, I replied, calmly. The FBI's Environmental Crime Task Force provided surveillance coordination. The Department of Justice's Public Integrity Section handled the judicial corruption aspects. The DEA assisted with money laundering investigations. Even the IRS Criminal Investigation Division was involved to track the financial networks. Owen Sterling slumped further against his restraints. This goes all the way to Washington, Owen Agent Rodriguez said, showing him the tablet. This goes all the way to the Attorney General's office. Your case was briefed to the highest levels of the Justice Department, because the scope of the corruption threatened the integrity of the entire federal environmental protection system. I moved closer to the display screens, bringing up a new image, a photograph of a conference room filled with federal agents, prosecutors, and officials from multiple agencies. This photo was taken 6 months ago at the Justice Department, I explained. Every person in this room was working on different aspects of tonight's operation. The FBI agent on the left was coordinating surveillance of Judge Harrison's lake house. The prosecutor next to him was building the ARCO case against your network. The EPA administrator at the head of the table was authorizing the resources for an operation unprecedented in environmental law enforcement. Carol Sterling wiped tears from her eyes. You had an army working against us. We had an army working to protect the communities you were poisoning, I corrected. And every single person in that room volunteered for this assignment after seeing the medical reports from Riverside Meadows. Agent Rodriguez pulled up another document. The technical support alone required specialists from 6 different agencies. NSA provided encryption analysis for your offshore communications. Secret Service assisted with financial crime tracking. Even NASA provided satellite imagery to document environmental damage at contaminated sites. The scope was overwhelming. Dave Milliken found his voice. Why didn't anyone leak this? Investigations this big always have leaks, because everyone involved had seen the photographs of dead children, I replied quietly. When you're working to prevent more kids from dying of cancer, operational security becomes personal. I clicked to the next image. A secure facility that looked like something from a spy movie. This is the Joint Task Force Command Center established specifically for this operation. 24-hour monitoring of all subjects, real-time coordination across 7 states, instant communication with field teams. Aaron Stone was shaking his head frantically. You're talking about massive federal resources. Why was this case worth all that? Agent Rodriguez answered before I could. Because environmental terrorism cases like this one set precedents for how the federal government responds to systematic poisoning of American communities. The Attorney General made it clear that no expense would be spared to ensure these prosecutions succeed. I pulled up another photograph, a meeting between federal officials and community leaders. But the most important support didn't come from Washington. It came from the communities you harmed. The image showed Patricia Rodriguez and dozens of other parents, all holding photographs of their sick children. Every family affected by your contamination was contacted by our victim advocacy team, I continued. They provided medical records, testimony, and most importantly, the motivation for everyone working this case to see it through. Patricia Rodriguez stepped forward again. Agent Chen, tell them about the support groups. I nodded, pulling up another image. A community center filled with families. We established support networks in every affected community. Parents whose children were sick, families who had lost loved ones, elderly residents whose life savings were spent on medical bills because of contamination you caused. Nick looked like he might be sick. How many families? Over 400 families, across 17 contaminated sites, I replied. Each one provided evidence, testimony, and documentation of how your crimes affected their lives. I clicked to a new display showing medical records and financial documents. The community support network also helped us understand the full scope of your crimes. Families shared medical bills, insurance claims, and documentation of property value losses due to contamination. Owen Sterling whispered, "Property values. When groundwater is contaminated, homes become worthless," Agent Rodriguez explained. "The economic damage from your environmental crimes exceeds $200 million. That's not counting medical costs or wrongful death claims." I pulled up a map showing affected areas. But the communities provided more than evidence. They provided witnesses. Over 300 people are prepared to testify about how Sterling and Associates' crimes affected their families. The number was staggering. 300 witnesses meant 300 personal stories of loss, illness, and betrayal. "The hardest part of this investigation," I said, looking around at the faces of people who were finally understanding the human cost of environmental crime, wasn't gathering evidence or maintaining my cover. It wasn't attending community meetings where parents begged for help while their children got sicker. I clicked to a final image, a packed auditorium, where I was speaking to a crowd of concerned families. This photo was taken 8 months ago at a public hearing about water quality in Riverside Meadows. I continued. "I'm testifying as Agent Chen, supposedly representing the EPA's investigation into contamination reports. But what these families didn't know was that I was also gathering evidence from my marriage to Nick about how the contamination was deliberately covered up. The irony was devastating. While I was publicly promising these families that justice would come, I was privately documenting the crimes that had poisoned their children. Every resource, every agency, every person involved in this operation was motivated by one thing," I concluded. "Making sure that the communities you harmed would finally see justice." But even with all that support, the network we were fighting had resources of their own. Agent Rodriguez approached the main display screen with a tablet that contained what would become the prosecution's most devastating weapon. A comprehensive database of evidence that had taken 18 months to compile. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to the still stunned crowd, "what you're about to see represents the most thorough documentation of environmental crimes in federal law enforcement history." I watched Nick's face as the first screen appeared, a digital filing system with thousands of organized documents, recordings, photographs, and financial records. Every conversation Nick had in our home was recorded and transcribed, I explained, scrolling through hundreds of files. Every phone call he made was documented. Every meeting he attended was surveilled. Every document he brought home was photographed and analyzed. The sheer volume was overwhelming. Owen Sterling stared at the screen with growing horror. "How many hours of recordings?" 2,437 hours. Agent Rodriguez replied without hesitation. "All legally obtained under federal surveillance warrants. All authenticated and verified by digital forensics experts." I clicked to a specific folder labeled Financial Crimes. The screen filled with bank statements, transfer records, and offshore account documentation. "These are the financial records from Sterling and Associates' bribery operations," I continued. Every payment to Inspector Webb, every transaction involving Judge Harrison's lake house, every dollar paid to environmental consultants for falsified reports. Dave Milliken was shaking his head frantically. You can't have access to our bank records without warrants, I interrupted, pulling up a different screen. Dave, we have 47 separate federal warrants authorizing surveillance of Sterling and Associates' financial activities, signed by 3 different federal judges in 2 districts. Aaron Stone found his voice. 3 judges. How is that possible? Agent Rodriguez answered. When we discovered that Judge Harrison was compromised, we obtained warrants from federal judges outside his jurisdiction. Every piece of financial evidence was independently verified by multiple banking authorities. I scrolled to another section. Video evidence. The screen displayed hundreds of thumbnail images from surveillance cameras. This is footage from the hidden cameras we installed in Judge Harrison's lake house, I explained, clicking on one of the videos. This particular recording shows Owen Sterling handing Harrison an envelope containing $50,000 in cash to dismiss the Riverside environmental lawsuit. The video was crystal clear, Sterling counting out bills while Harrison smiled and nodded. The audio was equally damning, with both men laughing about tree huggers, having no idea how the system really worked. Owen Sterling slumped further against his restraints. That was a private meeting. It was a criminal conspiracy being planned on property under federal surveillance. Agent Rodriguez corrected. You lost any expectation of privacy when you used that location to plan federal crimes. I moved to another folder, Victim Impact Documentation. This section contained medical records, photographs of sick children, and testimony from affected families. This is Emma Rodriguez's medical file, I said quietly, displaying the tragic progression of a little girl's battle with leukemia. Her cancer markers directly correlate with the specific chemical contamination found at the Riverside site. Patricia Rodriguez stepped forward again, her voice steady despite her tears. Show them the water test results. I clicked to a new screen showing laboratory analysis of water samples from Riverside Meadows. The chemical contamination levels were highlighted in red, dangerous levels that exceeded federal safety standards by factors of 10 or more. These tests were conducted independently by 3 different laboratories, I explained. EPA, CDC, and a private environmental testing company all confirmed identical results. Nick was staring at the evidence with something approaching disbelief. We had our own tests done. The consultants said. Your consultants lied, I interrupted, pulling up another screen. These are the real soil and water tests from Riverside, conducted before your development began. The contamination was already severe. Your environmental consultant, Ecological Solutions Inc., was paid an additional $100,000 to substitute fake results. I scrolled to a recording file and pressed play. Nick's own voice filled the ballroom. Just tell them the contamination is within acceptable limits. We've got too much invested to start over now. If some families get sick, that's their problem. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the federal agents looked uncomfortable hearing such callous disregard for human life. Carol Sterling whispered, "You recorded that in your own home." "I recorded my husband confessing to crimes that would kill children," I replied. "Yes, in our home. In our bedroom. At our dinner table. Every time Nick bragged about poisoning communities, it was documented." Agent Rodriguez pulled up another massive folder. Communications evidence. This contained thousands of emails, text messages, and phone records. This is the Digital Communications Archive, she explained. Every email Sterling and Associates sent about environmental cases. Every text message coordinating bribes. Every phone call planning falsified reports. I clicked on a specific email thread between Owen Sterling and Dave Milliken. The subject line read, "Riverside cleanup costs. Bury this." This email chain shows you calculating that it would cost $12 million to properly remediate the Riverside contamination. I read aloud. Your conclusion was that it would be cheaper to pay bribes and falsify reports than to actually clean up the site. Dave Milliken looked like he might vomit. That was just we were exploring options. You were choosing profits over children's lives, I said sharply. The next email in this thread has you joking about acceptable losses in the community if contamination caused health problems. Aaron Stone made one last desperate attempt. Even if all this evidence is real, it was obtained illegally. Spousal surveillance, hidden cameras. Aaron Agent Rodriguez interrupted. Every piece of evidence was obtained under properly executed federal warrants. Agent Chen was acting as a sworn federal officer throughout this investigation. Everything she did was legally authorized and supervised. I pulled up the final folder, Conspiracy Network. This contained organizational charts showing connections between law firms, environmental consultants, judges, and inspectors across 7 states. This is the complete network map, I announced. 47 law firms using identical methods. 23 environmental consulting companies providing falsified reports. 15 judges taking bribes to dismiss environmental lawsuits. 8 state officials providing regulatory protection in exchange for campaign contributions. The scope was staggering. This wasn't just about Sterling and Associates anymore. It was about a systematic corruption of environmental protection across multiple states. The evidence mountain doesn't just convict you, I concluded, looking at the 4 arrested lawyers. It provides the foundation for prosecuting the entire network. But there was one more revelation that would show them just how deep the corruption went. As the overwhelming scope of evidence settled over the ballroom, I noticed something in Nick's expression that I recognized from 18 months of marriage, the calculating look he got when he was planning something desperate. It was time to reveal the final piece of Sterling and Associates' arrogance. "There's something else you all need to know," I announced, pulling up a new folder on the display screen. "While we were gathering evidence against you, you were planning something against me." Agent Rodriguez stepped forward with a grim expression. 3 weeks ago, our surveillance detected unusual activity. Sterling and Associates had hired a private investigation firm to conduct background checks on Agent Chen. Nick's face went pale, but Owen Sterling tried to maintain composure. "That's just standard procedure when someone new joins our social circle." Owen, I interrupted, displaying the first document. "This is a contract between Sterling and Associates and Blackwater Investigations for comprehensive background analysis and reputation destruction services." The fee was $200,000. The silence was deafening as the crowd processed what they were seeing. "Reputation destruction," Carol Sterling whispered. I clicked to the next document, a detailed plan outlining how to discredit me professionally and personally. "This is Blackwater's strategy memo. Phase 1 involved fabricating evidence that I was mentally unstable. Phase 2 included creating false allegations about my professional conduct. Phase 3 was designed to have me committed for psychiatric evaluation." Dave Milliken was shaking his head frantically. "We never authorized anything like that," Dave Agent Rodriguez said, pulling up bank records. "This is a wire transfer from your personal account to Blackwater Investigations, dated 2 weeks ago. The memo line reads, 'Final payment for Mira neutralization project.'" The words neutralization project hung in the air like a physical threat. Aaron Stone found his voice. "That doesn't prove we knew what they were planning." Aaron, I said, pulling up an email. This is your message to Blackwater's director. Whatever it takes to discredit the wife. She's been asking too many questions about our environmental work. Make her disappear from our lives permanently. I let that sink in before continuing. Make me disappear permanently. Not just from your social circle, permanently. Nick was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, complete panic mixed with something that looked like genuine fear. Mira, I swear I didn't know they meant. Nick, I interrupted, displaying another document. This is your email to Owen Sterling from last week. Mira's been acting strange lately, recording conversations, asking detailed questions about our cases. I think she might be working for environmental groups. We need to handle this before she becomes a problem. The crowd was completely silent now, understanding that they were witnessing something far more sinister than corporate corruption. Agent Rodriguez pulled up another screen showing surveillance footage. This is video from 3 days ago. Owen Sterling meeting with Marcus Volkov, the director of Blackwater investigations at the Riverside Country Club. The video showed Sterling handing over a thick envelope while discussing something intensely with a man who looked like he belonged in organized crime rather than private investigation. Volkov specialized in making inconvenient people disappear, I continued. His methods included manufacturing evidence of mental illness, orchestrating apparent accidents, and in extreme cases, arranging for targets to be found dead from apparent suicide. Carol Sterling was openly weeping now. Owen, what did you do? He hired someone to kill me, I said simply. Because I was asking too many questions about why children were getting cancer near your development projects. I clicked to another document, a timeline showing the escalation of their plans. The psychiatric commitment was scheduled for this Friday. I would have been declared mentally incompetent and institutionalized. My testimony about environmental crimes would have been dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed mind. Owen Sterling was shaking his head desperately. That wasn't the plan. We just wanted to discredit. Owen, Agent Rodriguez interrupted. We have recordings of your conversations with Volkov. You specifically discussed making Agent Chen's death look like suicide brought on by mental illness. The weight of that accusation seemed to crush what remained of Sterling's composure. The beautiful irony, I continued, is that your plan to neutralize me provided additional evidence of criminal conspiracy. Attempting to murder a federal agent during an active investigation adds another 25 years to your sentence. Nick looked like he might collapse. Mira, I never wanted you hurt. I loved you. You loved the idea of me. I corrected sadly. The naive wife who wouldn't ask difficult questions. When I started acting like the trained federal investigator I actually am, you decided I needed to disappear. I pulled up the final document in this folder, a payment schedule showing how the murder would have been funded. This is the payment structure for my assassination, I announced to the stunned crowd. $50,000 up front, $100,000 on completion, and a $50,000 bonus if my death discredited ongoing environmental investigations. Agent Rodriguez checked her phone and looked up with grim satisfaction. Marcus Volkov was arrested 2 hours ago at his office. He was found with detailed plans for Agent Chen's murder, including methods for making it appear accidental. The scope of their desperation was finally clear to everyone present. These weren't just lawyers who had bent environmental rules, they were people willing to commit murder to protect their criminal enterprise. The counterattack failed, I concluded, because you never understood who you were really fighting. You thought you were dealing with an inconvenient wife. You were actually trying to murder a federal agent who had already gathered enough evidence to destroy your entire network. Patricia Rodriguez stepped forward again, her voice filled with quiet rage. You were going to kill her for trying to protect our children. The question hung in the air without answer, because there was no justification for what Sterling and associates had planned. But their willingness to commit murder was just one part of a conspiracy that reached much further than anyone had imagined. Agent Rodriguez's phone had been buzzing constantly throughout the evening, but the expression on her face as she read the latest message told me that the arrests happening simultaneously across the country were revealing something even more disturbing than we had anticipated. "Agent Chen," she said, her voice carrying a new urgency, "we need to show everyone the real scope of what we've uncovered tonight." I nodded, understanding that the Sterling and Associates network was just one tentacle of something much larger. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've witnessed tonight is not an isolated case of corporate corruption. It's part of a coordinated attack on environmental protection that spans the entire western United States." The display screen changed to show a map of the United States with red dots marking locations across multiple states. Each dot represented a law firm, consulting company, or government office that was part of the network. "This is the complete conspiracy," I announced. 47 law firms, operating in identical patterns, using the same methods, often coordinating their activities across state lines. Owen Sterling was staring at the map with growing horror. "That's impossible. We never coordinated with other firms." Agent Rodriguez interrupted, pulling up a series of email communications. "These are messages between Sterling and Associates and law firms in 6 other states. You were sharing strategies for bribing inspectors, trading information about which judges could be bought, and coordinating the timing of development projects to avoid federal oversight." I clicked to zoom in on the Pacific Northwest region. The network operates like a criminal franchise. Each law firm uses identical methods but maintains plausible deniability by avoiding direct communication. Instead, they coordinate through intermediaries. Dave Milliken found his voice. "What intermediaries?" "Environmental consulting companies that work for multiple law firms," I replied, highlighting several companies on the map. "Ecological Solutions Inc., the company that falsified your environmental reports, also provides identical services to law firms in Oregon, Washington, Nevada, and Colorado." Agent Rodriguez pulled up a new document. "This is the master client list from Ecological Solutions Inc. They've provided falsified environmental reports for over 300 development projects across 7 states. The scope was staggering. 300 projects meant thousands of families potentially exposed to contamination." Aaron Stone was shaking his head frantically. "You can't prove we knew about other states." "Aaron," I said, displaying a conference schedule, "this is the agenda from the Western Environmental Law Conference that you attended last year. The panel you participated in was titled Streamlining Environmental Compliance Across Multiple Jurisdictions. Your presentation specifically outlined how to coordinate environmental fraud across state lines." I clicked to show photographs from the conference. Aaron Stone presenting to a room full of lawyers from different states, all taking notes on his streamlining strategies. But the coordination goes deeper than just sharing strategies. Agent Rodriguez continued, pulling up financial records. The law firms were also sharing the costs of bribing federal officials. She displayed a spreadsheet showing contributions to what appeared to be a joint fund. Sterling and Associates contributed $400,000 last year to something called the Western Development Initiative. So did law firms in 6 other states. Carol Sterling whispered, "What was the money for?" "Bribing EPA regional administrators," I replied grimly. The Western Development Initiative was a slush fund used to corrupt federal environmental oversight across the entire Western region. I pulled up photographs of federal officials at luxury resorts, receiving envelopes from well-dressed men who looked like corporate lawyers. These EPA administrators were supposed to be conducting independent reviews of environmental impact assessments. Instead, they were being paid to rubber stamp approvals for projects they knew were environmentally dangerous. Nick looked like he might be sick. "Federal administrators? How many?" 17 EPA officials, including 3 regional administrators who oversee environmental compliance for 11 western states, Agent Rodriguez answered. They were all arrested tonight. The implications were overwhelming. The entire federal environmental protection system for the western United States had been compromised. The network also included coordination with state-level politicians. I continued, displaying another set of documents. Campaign contributions were funneled through the law firms to governors, state legislators, and attorney generals who could influence environmental regulations. Owen Sterling slumped against his restraints. How many politicians? 43 elected officials across 7 states have received money from this network, Agent Rodriguez replied, including 2 governors who signed legislation weakening environmental protections in exchange for campaign contributions. I pulled up a timeline showing how the network had evolved over the past decade. The conspiracy started small, just a few law firms sharing strategies for circumventing environmental regulations. But it grew into a coordinated attack on the entire federal environmental protection system. The timeline showed the progression from local bribery to regional coordination to federal corruption to political influence. The goal wasn't just to approve individual development projects, I explained. It was to systematically dismantle environmental protection across the western United States, to create a region where corporations could operate without any meaningful environmental oversight. Patricia Rodriguez spoke up from the crowd. How many communities are affected? Based on tonight's arrests and the evidence we've gathered, Agent Rodriguez replied, we estimate that over 50,000 families across 7 states have been exposed to contamination that could have been prevented if environmental protections had been properly enforced. The number was staggering. 50,000 families meant hundreds of thousands of people potentially affected by this conspiracy. The Riverside development that poisoned your community, I said to Patricia, was just one project in a network that spans from California to Colorado. Children are getting sick in dozens of communities because this network prioritized profits over public health. I clicked to show a final image. A photograph of children playing in a contaminated area, unaware of the danger around them. Every family affected by this conspiracy trusted that their government would protect them. Instead, their safety was sold to the highest bidder. The emotional weight of that betrayal seemed to settle over everyone in the ballroom. This wasn't just about corporate greed anymore. It was about the systematic corruption of the institutions that families trusted to keep their children safe. But even as the scope of the conspiracy became clear, there was one more revelation that would show just how far the network's influence had spread. Agent Rodriguez received what appeared to be an urgent call, stepping away to take it while the ballroom remained transfixed by the scope of corruption we had revealed. When she returned, her expression was grim but determined. That was the Attorney General's office, she announced to the crowd. The simultaneous arrests across 7 states have uncovered something we didn't expect. This network extends beyond environmental crimes. I felt a chill as she pulled up a new set of documents on the display screen. After 18 months of investigation, I thought we had mapped the complete conspiracy. But the evidence now appearing suggested we had only scratched the surface. The financial records seized tonight reveal that the environmental corruption network was being used to facilitate other types of federal crimes, Rodriguez continued. Money laundering, tax evasion, fraud involving federal infrastructure projects, and systematic bribery of federal contractors. Owen Sterling was staring at the screen with something approaching terror. We only did environmental work. Owen, I said, pulling up a bank statement. This is Sterling and Associates business account. These deposits don't correspond to any environmental cases. They're payments for facilitating non-environmental crimes, using your network of corrupt officials. The bank records showed payments that dwarfed anything we had seen related to environmental fraud. Millions of dollars moving through accounts that should have contained only legal fees. Dave Milliken's voice was barely a whisper. What kind of other crimes? Agent Rodriguez pulled up a federal infrastructure map marked with suspicious projects. The same judges you bribed to dismiss environmental lawsuits were also approving inflated contracts for federal highway projects, military base construction, and public building development. I clicked to show a specific case. Judge Harrison didn't just rule in favor of your environmental cases. He also approved a $400 million highway contract that should have cost half that amount. The extra money was split between the construction company and the law firms that facilitated the deal. Aaron Stone was shaking his head frantically. We never worked on highway contracts. You didn't need to, Agent Rodriguez explained. Your network of corrupt officials was rented out to other criminal enterprises. Sterling and Associates provided access to bought judges, and other organizations used that access for their own crimes. The implications were staggering. Not only had they corrupted environmental protection, but they had turned their corruption into a service they provided to other criminals. This document, I said, displaying a contract, shows Sterling and Associates agreeing to provide judicial access and regulatory compliance services to Apex Construction for their federal projects. You were literally selling your corrupt network. Nick looked like he might collapse. Mira, I swear we didn't know. Nick, I interrupted, showing him an email he had sent. This is your message to Owen Sterling. The Harrison connection is paying off. We made more money this month from non-environmental cases than from our regular practice. You knew exactly what was happening. Carol Sterling was openly weeping. How much money are we talking about? Agent Rodriguez pulled up financial summaries from multiple accounts. Based on the records seized tonight, the Sterling and Associates network facilitated approximately $800 million in federal crimes over the past 3 years. The amount was incomprehensible. $800 million in stolen taxpayer money, facilitated by lawyers who were supposed to uphold the law. But the financial crimes are just part of it, I continued, pulling up another set of documents. The network was also used to obstruct justice in federal investigations unrelated to environmental issues. I displayed a communication log showing contacts between Sterling and Associates and federal agents who were supposed to be conducting investigations into various crimes. You used your network to provide advance warning to criminals when federal investigations were targeting them, I explained. Companies under investigation for fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering were paying Sterling and Associates for inside information about federal law enforcement activities. Owen Sterling slumped against his restraints. How many federal agents? 23 FBI agents, 14 IRS investigators, and 8 DEA officers have been arrested tonight, Agent Rodriguez replied. All of them were providing confidential information to your network in exchange for payments. The scope was beyond anything anyone in the ballroom could have imagined. This wasn't just environmental corruption, it was systematic corruption of federal law enforcement itself. The really disturbing part, I said, pulling up a timeline, is how this evolved. You started by bribing local inspectors to overlook environmental violations. But once you had a system for corrupting officials, other criminals wanted to use that system. The timeline showed the progression from environmental crimes to a full-service corruption network that facilitated everything from tax fraud to obstruction of justice. Sterling and Associates became a criminal services company, Agent Rodriguez added. Need a judge bot. Call Sterling and Associates. Need federal investigators compromised? Sterling and Associates could arrange it. Need environmental crimes covered up? That was just their original specialty. I looked around the ballroom at faces that showed complete shock and disbelief. Even the federal agents looked stunned by the scope of what had been uncovered. The arrests tonight include 137 people across 7 states, I announced. Law firm partners, environmental consultants, federal judges, EPA administrators, FBI agents, IRS investigators, construction company executives, and political officials up to and including state governors. Patricia Rodriguez stepped forward, her voice filled with quiet rage. You turned the entire justice system into a criminal enterprise. The question hung in the air without answer because there was no justification for what had been revealed. Every family that trusted the government to protect them, I said, looking directly at the arrested lawyers, was betrayed by a network that sold justice to the highest bidder. But the true cost of this betrayal was about to become clear in the most personal way possible. The ballroom had fallen into an eerie silence, broken only by the soft sounds of federal agents coordinating with their teams across the country. But I knew it was time for the most difficult part of this entire operation, the final confrontation with the man I had once loved. Nick, I said quietly, approaching him as he stood in handcuffs, his expensive tuxedo now wrinkled and his perfect image completely shattered. Do you understand what you've done? He looked up at me, with eyes that seemed to see me clearly for the first time in 18 months. Mira, I never meant for children to get hurt. But they did get hurt, I replied, my voice steady despite the emotion churning inside me. Emma Rodriguez is dead, Nick. A 6-year-old girl who trusted you to keep her safe is dead because you chose money over her life. The weight of that single name seemed to crush what remained of his composure. I didn't know she would die. We thought the contamination levels were manageable. Patricia Rodriguez stepped forward, her voice filled with quiet fury. My daughter's cancer was manageable to you. Nick couldn't meet her eyes. The confident lawyer who had dismissed me as clueless just hours earlier was gone, replaced by a broken man facing the consequences of his choices. You stood in my living room last year, Patricia continued, and promised my daughter that lawyers like you would never let anything bad happen to children. Do you remember that promise? I remember, Nick whispered. She believed you, Patricia said, tears flowing freely now. Even when she was dying, even when the doctors said there was no hope, she still believed that the adults in her world were trying to protect her. I pulled out my phone and displayed a photograph of Emma Rodriguez, the same gap-toothed smile, the same bright eyes that had trusted Nick to keep her safe. This is who you killed, I said quietly. Not some abstract victim in a lawsuit. This specific little girl with her drawings of butterflies and her faith that grown-ups would protect her. Nick was openly sobbing now, the weight of his crimes finally penetrating the wall of rationalization he had built around himself. Owen Sterling tried to interrupt. This is emotional manipulation. We never intended. Owen, Agent Rodriguez cut him off sharply. Intent doesn't matter when the result is dead children. You knew the risks. You chose to ignore them. That makes you legally and morally responsible for every death. I turned back to Nick, needing him to understand the complete scope of what he had lost. You didn't just destroy communities, Nick. You destroyed us. You destroyed any chance we might have had for a real marriage built on truth instead of lies. I loved you, he said desperately. That was real. You loved having a wife who made you feel superior, I corrected sadly. Someone you could patronize and dismiss. When I started acting like the educated professional I actually am, you decided I needed to be eliminated. I pulled out the contract with Blackwater Investigations, the one authorizing my murder. This is how much you loved me, Nick. When I became inconvenient, you hired someone to kill me. The contract seemed to physically wound him. His shoulders sagged as he read his own signature authorizing my assassination. The saddest part, I continued, is that you never once asked about my background, my education or my career. You were so convinced of your own superiority that you never bothered to learn who I really was. Dave Milliken found his voice. What happens to us now? Agent Rodriguez answered without hesitation. Federal prison. Minimum 25 years for environmental terrorism. Additional sentences for racketeering, bribery, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice. Most of you will die in prison. The finality of that statement seemed to break Aaron's stone completely. Our families, our children, will grow up knowing their fathers poisoned other people's children for money, I said bluntly. That's the legacy you've chosen. Patricia Rodriguez stepped forward one final time. My daughter's last words were asking if the water was safe to drink. I told her yes, because I trusted that people like you were protecting her. I will carry that lie for the rest of my life. Nick looked up at her with something approaching genuine remorse. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't mean anything, but I'm sorry. You're right, Patricia replied quietly. It doesn't mean anything. Sorry doesn't bring back my daughter. The confrontation was over. There was nothing left to say, no redemption possible, no forgiveness that could undo the damage they had caused. As federal agents prepared to transport the prisoners, I realized that this moment, seeing Nick stripped of his arrogance and forced to confront the human cost of his crimes, was both the most satisfying and the most heartbreaking part of the entire investigation. As the federal agents began processing the arrests and preparing to transport Nick and his colleagues, my phone buzzed with an urgent call from the EPA director's office. The conversation was brief but transformative. Agent Chen, Agent Rodriguez said as I ended the call, what was that about? I turned to address the crowd, many of whom were still processing the magnitude of what they had witnessed. That was EPA Director Sarah Williams. The Environmental Crimes Task Force has been given emergency authority to begin immediate remediation of all contaminated sites identified in tonight's investigation. The implications began to sink in for everyone present. This wasn't just about arrests and prosecutions anymore. It was about immediate action to protect communities. Starting tomorrow morning, I continued, EPA emergency response teams will begin cleanup operations at Riverside Meadows and 16 other contaminated sites across 7 states. The cost will be covered by assets seized from the criminal network. Patricia Rodriguez stepped forward with tears in her eyes. Our water will be safe. Within 60 days, every family affected by contamination will have access to clean water, I confirmed. The same network that poisoned your communities will pay for the cleanup through asset forfeiture. Agent Rodriguez pulled up a document on her tablet. The Department of Justice has also authorized the immediate establishment of victim compensation funds. Every family affected by environmental crimes committed by this network will receive medical compensation and property value restoration. The transformation was happening in real time. Owen Sterling's lake house, Judge Harrison's luxury properties, the offshore accounts used for bribes, all of it would be liquidated to fund cleanup efforts and victim compensation. But the changes go beyond just fixing the immediate damage, I announced, pulling up a new document on the display screen. The evidence gathered in this investigation has prompted federal legislation to completely overhaul environmental crime enforcement. The document showed proposed changes to environmental law that would make the kind of systematic corruption we had exposed impossible to repeat. Environmental consulting companies will now be subject to federal oversight and licensing, I explained. Judges who handle environmental cases will be required to disclose all financial relationships with development companies. EPA inspectors will be monitored by independent oversight boards. Dave Milliken, despite his handcuffs, found his voice. You're changing the entire system. We're fixing the system you broke, Agent Rodriguez replied sharply. The Environmental Protection Act of 2024 will will include provisions specifically designed to prevent the kind of network corruption you created. I looked around the ballroom at faces that showed a mixture of shock, relief, and cautious hope. The law will also establish mandatory sentences for environmental terrorism. Anyone who knowingly contaminates water supplies or falsifies environmental reports will face federal charges with no possibility of plea bargaining. Carol Sterling whispered, "How long have you been planning all this?" "The legislative proposals have been in development for 2 years," I replied. "Every crime we documented, every corruption method we exposed, every gap in environmental protection we identified, all of it has been used to draft comprehensive reforms." The scope was overwhelming. Not only had we exposed and prosecuted the criminal network, but we had used the evidence to create permanent changes that would prevent similar crimes in the future. The Sterling and Associates case will be taught in law schools as an example of how environmental protection should work, Agent Rodriguez added. "Your crimes have become the foundation for a new era of environmental law enforcement." Patricia Rodriguez wiped tears from her eyes. "Emma's death. It will mean something. Emma's death will save other children," I said quietly. "The Emma Rodriguez Environmental Protection Memorial Act will be introduced in Congress next month. It will establish the strongest environmental crime penalties in federal law." The transformation was complete. What had started as a charity gala had become the catalyst for systemic change that would protect communities across the entire country. As federal agents led the prisoners toward the ballroom exits, I realized that this was exactly what we had hoped for when the investigation began. Not just justice for past crimes, but prevention of future ones. The real work was just beginning. As dawn broke over the city skyline, visible through the ballroom's floor-to-ceiling windows, my phone had been buzzing constantly with updates from across the country. The Sterling and Associates investigation had triggered something unprecedented, a nationwide awakening about environmental crime that was spreading far beyond our original targets. Agent Chen, Rodriguez said, approaching with her tablet displaying news feeds, "You need to see what's happening." The screen showed live news broadcasts from multiple cities. Environmental groups were holding emergency press conferences. Law firms were scrambling to review their environmental practices. Most importantly, families and communities across the western United States were demanding investigations into their own water quality. Riverside Meadows was just the beginning, I said to the remaining crowd in the ballroom. In the past 6 hours, we've received over 400 calls to our environmental crime hotline. Communities that thought their water was safe are demanding independent testing. Patricia Rodriguez stepped forward, her voice stronger now despite her exhaustion. Other families are fighting back. Environmental groups in 12 states have filed lawsuits demanding comprehensive water testing in areas where similar law firms operate. Agent Rodriguez confirmed. "The legal precedent we've established tonight is being used to challenge potentially hundreds of contaminated sites." I pulled up a map on the display screen showing the locations of new investigations that had been triggered by our revelations. Red dots were appearing across the western United States as communities demanded accountability. More importantly, I continued, other federal agents are coming forward with information about corruption they've witnessed, but were afraid to report. The network we exposed tonight was just one part of a much larger system of environmental crime. Heidi Kelly from the DA's office, who had been quietly observing throughout the night, finally spoke up. "How many more networks are out there?" "We don't know yet," I replied, honestly. "But based on the calls we've received tonight, we estimate there are similar operations in at least 14 states. The Sterling and Associates model appears to have been replicated across the entire country." The scope was staggering, but also hopeful. For the first time in decades, Communities had a roadmap for fighting back against systematic environmental crime. The evidence standards we established for this case, Agent Rodriguez added, are now being used by EPA offices nationwide. Other undercover investigations are being planned based on the methods we developed here. I looked around the ballroom at the faces of people who had witnessed history being made. What happened tonight wasn't just about bringing down one criminal network. It was about proving that environmental crime can be prosecuted successfully at the highest levels. My phone buzzed with another update, this one from the White House. The president is establishing a new environmental crime task force with offices in every federal district. I announced, the Sterling and Associates case has been designated as the template for a new approach to environmental law enforcement. Patricia Rodriguez wiped tears from her eyes. Emma's story, it's giving other families hope. Emma's story is inspiring a movement, I confirmed. The Environmental Protection Memorial Fund established in her name will fund community advocacy groups nationwide. Families won't have to fight these battles alone anymore. The charity gala that had started the evening was long forgotten. In its place was something far more powerful, a network of communities, advocates, and federal agents working together to ensure that what happened in Riverside Meadows would never happen again. As the last of the federal agents finished their work, and the ballroom began to empty, I realized that Nick's public humiliation of me had accomplished something he never could have imagined. It had given us the perfect stage to expose the corruption that had been poisoning communities for years. The work ahead would be challenging, but for the first time since the Blackwater River case, I felt genuine hope that environmental protection could work the way it was supposed to. 6 months later, I stood in the same ballroom where it all began, but this time for a very different kind of gathering. The Grandview Hotel's Crystal Ballroom was hosting the first annual Environmental Justice Awards ceremony, and the transformation was remarkable. Where corrupt lawyers had once schemed over champagne, environmental advocates now celebrated victories. Where Nick had once humiliated me for caring about tree-hugger causes, EPA administrators were announcing record numbers of successful prosecutions. Agent Chen, Patricia Rodriguez approached me, but she looked different now. Stronger, more hopeful. I wanted to thank you again. Patricia, you don't need to thank me, I replied warmly. You and Emma were the real heroes of this story. She smiled, holding up a photograph. It was Emma, but this time surrounded by other children, all healthy, all playing in clean water. This is the new playground in Riverside Meadows. The EPA finished the cleanup 2 months ahead of schedule. The transformation of Riverside Meadows had become a model for environmental restoration nationwide. Clean water, remediated soil, and a memorial garden where Emma's favorite butterflies now flourished. The Emma Rodriguez Environmental Protection Memorial Act passed Congress last month, I continued. Environmental terrorists now face mandatory federal sentences. What happened to your community can never happen again. My phone buzzed with a familiar notification. Another environmental crime network had been exposed using the methods we had developed. This one in Texas involving oil companies and corrupt state regulators. The ripple effect continued. Mira, Agent Rodriguez joined us, holding a tablet showing news reports. The Texas operation just resulted in 17 arrests. They're using our playbook exactly. I smiled, watching the news coverage of yet another environmental crime network being dismantled. How many is that now? 47 separate networks exposed in 18 months, she replied. Over 300 arrests nationwide. The Sterling and Associates investigation really did change everything. As I looked around the ballroom, I saw faces that represented hope rather than corruption. Environmental lawyers working pro bono for contaminated communities. EPA agents, who could finally do their jobs without interference. Families who had clean water for the first time in years. Nick and his colleagues were serving their sentences in federal prison. Owen Sterling had been sentenced to 45 years. Dave Milliken received 35 years. Aaron Stone got 28 years. Nick himself was facing 38 years without possibility of parole. But their downfall had created something beautiful. A system where environmental protection actually worked. You know what the best part is? Patricia asked, looking around at the celebration. What's that? Emma would have loved this, she said quietly. All these people working to protect children she'll never meet. Her butterflies are everywhere now. As the evening concluded, I realized that Nick's dismissive comment about me not understanding business had been prophetic in a way he never intended. I understood his business perfectly, and I had destroyed it completely. The new beginning was just starting.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.